I'm going to talk about why democratic capitalism doesn't seem to be working too well. So there's three things I want to talk about. One is called An American Tragedy, and we'll focus on the work that my colleague Ann Case and I have been doing on morbidity and mortality in the US. And then what I want to do is say, is this a threat to Britain? And the answer to that is yes and no. And then since we're thinking about evidence and social science, I put together some more or less random thoughts at the end about social science and methods and things like that. So here's the American Tragedy, and this is all joint with Ann Case. So let me just set the stage. A lot of this is about people in midlife. This is all-cause mortality for whites, ages 45 to 54, through the 20th century. Because it gets regularly misunderstood, almost everything I will show you is for men and women together. And it doesn't matter how often we say that. People then report the work as being about men. It's not about men, it's about men and women together. And if there's differences, I'll tell you, but there are very few. So this shows a very familiar picture of the sort of one of the greatest progresses in human history of declining mortality from about 1400. All of the pictures you're going to see are per 100,000 at the turn of the 20th century. You can see the flu epidemic at the end of the First World War. If this is a British slide, there would be a much bigger spike in 1914-18, but Americans didn't. So then you see this almost inexorable progress with around 1960, this flattening, which is to do with smoking, essentially, which had boomed in the 30s and 40s, and the consequences coming home to roost in the 60s. That's sort of more relevant than maybe we should have taken it, because it's another sort of epidemic that was induced by commercial interests, by and large, and that's sort of happening again. And then at the end of this period, you can see just before, I think 1999 is the last year there, we're down at about 400. This is England and Wales, it doesn't go back as far. We could have done that, but we didn't. And you can see the very similar process. That England and Wales historically has done better than the United States with lower mortality consistently. And what you see is that things that happen in the US tend to happen 5 or 6 years later in Britain, including the tobacco epidemic, but also the modern decline in mortality associated with smoking or reduction of smoking and antihypertensives begins a little earlier in the US, but then after a while you get the same pattern again. So remember now you really need to go back to this first one where 400 is at the end of it, and I want to show you what happened after that. This goes back to 1990 now for reasons that will become apparent in a minute. And this just shows rich countries in general: Canada, the UK, Germany, Ireland, Australia, Sweden, Italy. There's no pattern to the selection of countries here, except that we wanted to spread out the graph a bit and not have them all on top of each other. So there's no systematic selection here. It's just examples. But what you can see is mortality rates are falling about 2% a year throughout this period. So what had been happening before goes on happening, except in the US. And the US just comes apart. So you can see that it just stops. The red line there is US whites, men and women. And the blue line for comparison is US Hispanics. And the US Hispanics look like all the other rich countries. You might say, what happens to African Americans here? They have higher mortality rate than whites in this age group, as in all age groups, but it's been falling very rapidly. So it's been falling at about 2.5% a year as opposed to 2%. So that mortality rate has been falling faster than any other mortality rate in this picture until the last 2 or 3 years, where it's begun to turn up. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So what's doing that? Well, just to describe this a little more, life expectancy in the US has now fallen for 3 straight years, 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17. This really is a 1 in 100 year event. People like to talk about 1 in 100 year event, and they happen, of course, every 3 or 4 years. But this one really has not happened for a century. So the last time in the US life expectancy figures went up for 3 years in a row was at the end of the First World War with the flu epidemic and so on. The decline, I've shown you this picture for people in midlife, but the decline is actually being driven by what's happening to mortality among what economists like to call prime age adults from 25 to 64 years of age. So it's not just the midlife one. The midlife mortality one is the only case where all-cause mortality is rising, and that's because of a slowdown in the decline in mortality from heart disease has pretty much flattened out and is beginning to rise a little bit. And that, together with what I'm about to show you, is what's driven up the mortality rates. But the things I'm about to show you, and as you will see, are happening at much younger age groups too. So, okay. So here is the next part of the story, which is having found, the graph I just showed you was sort of the first thing we found, and we had no idea what was driving it. I'm very surprised. And we looked at the things, the mortality rates that were rising most rapidly in this age group, and here are the 3 of them. There are what they call accidental injuries, meaning drug overdoses, or drug overdose is a class of accidental injuries, suicide, and alcoholic liver disease. And these are what I think Anne at some point called deaths of despair. The idea being that at some level, these are all things you do to yourself. They're not infectious diseases. You can drink yourself to death quite slowly by blowing your liver out. You can kill yourself quite quickly by suicide, or you can take drugs of one sort or another. And these are mostly opioids that you're looking at here. And all of these have been rising very rapidly. What we also found, and this again is somewhat a surprise, is that this is in some sense all happening to people without a BA. Now, in America, it's a bit different from here, in that there really is this very sharp distinction between people who have a 4-year degree and people who do not. And all sorts of things over the last 30 years are hinging around that distinction. With people who have a 4-year university degree, you might think of as the elite, and they're sort of doing okay. And the people who don't have been really very seriously left behind. This division in the US for whites is about half and half. So half the population have university degrees, the other half do not. So it's about less than half of the population without 4-year degrees who are white. So you're talking about 40% or so of the population. And that 40% of the population has really been left behind, and most dramatically in the fact that these causes of mortality are rising. The suicide one is particularly worth noting because ever since Durkheim, and in fact before Durkheim, it was believed that education promoted suicide, that educated people were more likely to kill themselves. And it's sort of like education takes you out of the support group in which you grew up in and puts you out there sort of by yourself and promotes enemy and all that sort of stuff. And, we find Durkheim just incredibly helpful in thinking about all these things that, and the story we're going to tell is a Durkheimian story of the society in which working class Americans live has sort of deserted them and has fallen apart. But as early as 1990, these suicide rates were the other way around. So the epidemic has flipped the educational structure of suicide. I should say it's very important to note this is not supposed to be causal. I mean, part of the research program is to find out what is it about education that is causing this to happen. Okay. Oh, I should say also there's not been much change, maybe I said it already, in the fractions of people with and without a college degree over this period. Otherwise, you might worry about selection effects and so on. There are selection effects at different levels, but not here. So this is maybe the key graph. This is a cohort picture looking at birth cohorts. So each one of these, they're done for every 5 years, just so as not to clutter the graph. This again is deaths per 100,000, and it's age along the bottom, fairly obviously. And what we're doing is tracking each birth cohort starting in 1935, who we observe. These data start in about 1990 or 92. So we observed the 35 cohort first when they're 55 and so on, and track them through until their 70s. And the younger cohort, the 85 birth cohort, is obviously much younger and still quite younger. So if you look at the 35 cohort, it's sort of flat, and the 40 cohort is pretty flat. So what's happening is, oh, sorry, these are all people without a BA. So this is the left behind group. And these things are pretty much flat, so there's no very strong age effect in deaths of despair for those people. When you move up to the 40 and the 45 group, the 45 group is my group. It's a little bit higher, and you're beginning to see a bit of a slope. The 1950 group is beginning to clear the pack, and you're beginning to see a gradient, an age gradient. And then what happens is these things move up. So each cohort, each birth cohort is a higher risk than the previous birth cohort, and the age of they're rotating. So the age effects are getting stronger and stronger for the younger cohorts. So getting old is worse for the younger cohorts than it is, at least in terms of the risk from one of these deaths of despair. If you look at for BAs, here's the people with BAs, and you can see some of it there. I mean, these are moving up a little bit. And also even the previous graph, probably with BAs you would have expected mortality rates to fall, and they're not, so there's effects in there. Now, I mean, I live in Princeton, New Jersey, which is one of the richest towns in America, and people are dying there, and people among our social class. So, I know many mothers and fathers who've lost their kids. And the police are armed with Narcan, which is the thing to bring people back to life from drug overdoses. But people are dying on park benches, or people have died in park benches in Princeton. There are not bodies littering the street. I don't want to tell you that, but these are not uncommon occurrences. So, it's affecting us all, even these people. But out there, this is a real undergoing catastrophe. So the other thing that, in our book we have spent a lot of time on, even if you back away from mortality, there's a huge rising sea of pain and poor mental health underlying these conditions. So if you track through the surveys, the same birth cohort, and look at all forms of self-reported pain, lower back pain, neck pain, sciatic pain, everything you can imagine, they all look like these pictures that you've been seeing. So the roots of despair, this graph shows part of the story. And in fact, I think we're probably backing a little bit away from this graph, but what you've got on these are wages. So these are real wages and earnings, like hourly earnings. At the top are people with a BA. The bottom are people without a BA. You can see people with a BA have much, the profile rises more with age because you have to wait longer to get the fruits of your education. And then it goes on rising with age, whereas people who are doing closer to manual work, it's much flatter. Things economists have known for a very long time. But if you look at the top here, if you look at the birth cohort of 40, 45, 55, 75, and 90, as the blue arrow suggests, each cohort has higher wages than the last, which is progress. That's what you'd like. But the other one is going the other way. And so real wages, I mean, everybody's now writing about how real wages for people without a BA are really picking up in the US, but they're still way lower than they were in 1970. So we've had 50 years of real wage decline at the median for people without a BA in the United States. Now, a very important point of this is it's not like you come into work and they say, I've cut your wages by 10%. I mean, that's not what happens. People very, very rarely see wage cuts at work. I mean, it happens, but it's quite rare. So what actually happens is you come in one morning and they say, pack up your desk and get out of here. Or pack up, this factory's closing. And so you move from a $28 an hour job working for General Motors to trying to find what work you can, whether it's, the standard thing of working for McDonald's or whether you're working as a part-time parking lot attendant or whatever. So what is happening is it's just people taking worse and worse jobs. And I think sociologically that's very important. Because it's the loss in status and the loss in dignity and the loss in meaningfulness that comes with moving down from better jobs to worse jobs that's really doing bad things to people, not so much the loss of wage. It's surprising to us how little material deprivation really seems to matter in this story. The other thing you want to keep in mind is African Americans, who are much poorer than any of these people, are doing much better. Except for the last 2 or 3 years, but I'll come back to that. And this is another thing that's, I could again show you lots of indicators, but this is, I think, a really, really important one, that marriage has collapsed among people without a BA too. So this just shows the fraction not married. Sometimes it's better to look at the fractions never married, because then you don't get the widowhood and stuff like that in there to the same extent. But you can see for these people, there's not that much change, and yet this is falling very dramatically here. Again, we're talking about whites here. This, I think, is getting close to the crux of what's happening. People have moved away from marriage towards cohabitation. That's happening in Europe. It's happening here, too. But the cohabitations in America, unlike most European cohabitations, are very short-term. And so what happens is they get together, they have kids, or more than one kid. But then after a few years, the woman thinks, here's a guy with better prospects who hasn't moved down from General Motors to things. So she kicks the first guy out and gets someone else. So now the median white mother without a BA has had at least one child out of wedlock. And many of them have had several children out of wedlock. So you get these men in their 50s who may have had 3 or 4 kids and actually don't know any of them because they're all living with other men or living with their mother. And, if you want a recipe for disaster, that, again, it's not like losing money. You're losing basic support structures of life for these people. So this is what we call cumulative distress, and there's a whole list of horrible woes here. So starting from the base of a birth year in 1950, that's the people who entered the labor market in 1970. 1970 in America is a hinge year around which, everything that seems to have been going well started to really begin to go badly, including inequality. But for those without a BA, the steady cohort by cohort increases in suicide, mortality, drug overdose you've seen, chronic pain of all sorts, cyanic pain, difficulty socializing, difficulty relaxing. Those pictures all look the same. Mental distress, huge increase in heavy drinking, big increase in obesity, but obesity may explain about a quarter of what's happening. But even if you split up between people who are obese and people who are not obese, you get exactly the same effects. So the rising in obesity is part of the story. Also, Brits are not that much skinnier than Americans are, and you don't see these deaths here to the same extent. I'll show you that in a minute. People are not participating in the labor force. This is not a story of unemployment. As in Britain now, there's essentially lower unemployment rates than we've had historically. But there are a lot of people who are not participating in the labor force anymore. That started with men, and it's now spread to women. Again, without a BA, there's not much for people with a BA, low real wages. Huge decline in religion, especially among less educated people. That's probably much more important in America than it is here. But I think that, and some people, especially on the right, are arguing that that's the central thing that's really gone wrong. I don't believe that, because religion had already gone away in much of Europe, and you don't see these things, but I think the loss of religion has been really important. And 2/3 of people believe that elections are rigged by the rich and large corporations. When I say that, the typical reaction is only 2/3. And so these opportunities are just sort of steadily worsening. All right. What are the underlying factors? Well, the opioid catastrophe, which has, made a lot of pharmaceutical executives incredibly rich and killed huge numbers of people. Anne and I tend to argue that the opioids has thrown fuel on the flames and made something that was bad much, much worse, but that these lives were coming apart before the opioid catastrophe. And also, if you ask how much of it, about a little more than half, or more than a half, is not opioids, it's suicides and alcoholic liver disease. But opioids are clearly very, very important. And that may be, it's hard enough to, addiction is an incredibly difficult thing to deal with. But there's some sense that that's leveled off, and not much sign of decrease yet, but it seems to have leveled off at a very high level. So, this is the failure of capitalism, which that's all I'm really going to say about it. But in our book, we have about 100 pages on this, on what's happening to monopoly, to monopsony, to changes in the legal system, which is making life harder for working people. And so there really is this sense that in America, with globalization and automation making life difficult for working people, the state, instead of cushioning that and helping people deal with that, have seized on their weakness to hurt them further, push them down. And, we talk a lot about what we call reverse Robin Hood redistribution, which is redistribution from poor people up to rich people. And, many people say to us, well, how can you do that? The poor people don't have anything. I'm rich, and they're not worth it. And the point, of course, is there's a very large number of them. One of the things you always hear about is they say, even if you redistribute from rich to poor, it wouldn't do much, because there aren't all that many super rich people. So even if you took all their wealth away and spread it out, people would not get very much. You want to think about that precisely in reverse, which is you don't have to take very much money from a large number of poor people in order to make a huge fortune for a few people, like in pharma, for instance. So I want to talk a little bit about the American healthcare industry, and Andrew's slide typically was wonderful about this. So healthcare is the most expensive in the world. We have really bad health. Life expectancy is falling. And the best summary of the American healthcare system is it's really, really good at promoting the financial well-being of providers, and very, very bad at promoting the health and here's a picture from Max Roser's wonderful site. And the best thing I love about that site is you can suck down the data and make your own graphs. So this is one of our versions of this. So this shows the UK. Along the bottom here, you have money. So this is how much people are spending. And on the vertical axis is life expectancy. And this is the British. And you can see that bad things have been happening in the last few years, life expectancy. And what Andrew said is very, very important. I'm going to make the UK the sort of hero of this story. But, these problems are a problem everywhere, and especially with new cancer therapies, which are incredibly expensive and, do actually deliver stuff. And there's real questions about how much you want to spend on that. You spend a lot. Anyway, there's the UK. That's Australia, which looks sort of like UK, and has actually been, less money, more health a bit. There's Canada, which looks, as you might expect, a little bit more like the US, spends more. Here's France, which is often held up as the system that spends a bit more than the UK, but gets something for it. There's Switzerland. Switzerland is the second most expensive healthcare system in the world and spends about 12% of GDP on health. And they have a lot of insurance companies, which other countries seem to manage to do without. And so you spend a lot of money on health insurance companies. So here's the US. My clicker works. So you can see down the bottom there, 1970, 1980, it was a little worse than Switzerland, but not so much worse. If you go up to 1990, there's 2015. And you can see we're delivering a lot of money to these guys and getting nothing, in fact, negative things for it. We're driving down life expectancy by making a few people very, very rich. So what about Britain? Is this a threat to Britain? Well, I've got a no slide and a yes slide. The no slide's not so great either, but anyway, healthcare doesn't cost so much. If you were to reduce the share of GDP in America to the share of Switzerland, which is not the best you could do, you'd get $8,500 per household. And, this is one of the biggest forces in America that's driving down wages. Because you're making all this money for the healthcare sector. And you're not talking about small sums of money. I mean, these are, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. You're soon talking about real money, they'd like to say. You have much less lobbying here, or much less overt lobbying. There's some people who think, it's all done in London clubs, so you don't need to have all these people circling around Whitehall bribing people. You have a much better safety net than we have in America. And, if you look at what's happened to wage inequality in the UK, it's not so different from what's happened to the US. But the safety net has kept the bottom up in a way that's just not true in the US at all. You have much better control of opioids, but, read the newspapers. Matt Hancock was talking the other day about the dangers of this getting out of control. And you've got some bad stuff happening here too. Family destruction is not happening in the same way, but you see some of it. And this is something we just don't know about, but I think is potentially important. There's a much less sharp educational divide. So it's not black and white, as it seems to be in the US, that there's a lot of different grades. And we're still trying to sort that out, and we're working with IFS to try and do that. What about, yes, well, you've also had stagnant median wages for more than a decade. 10 years is better than 50 years. But if you let it go on, there's obvious real danger there. There's a rising share of profits, falling share of labor here, as in the US. Globalization, automation is a problem throughout the rich world. And it's not something that can't be handled by policy. But if the policy is wrong, that really is a disaster. The long decrease in mortality has stopped in Britain too, different age groups, slowing throughout all rich countries. Many Britons feel politically disenfranchised, as many Americans do. Their voice is not heard in Westminster. And you get these very sharp divisions by geography and level of schooling, which you see in Brexit. And this is clearly a worldwide problem. Also, this is a graph that IFS drew as part of the work we're doing with them. Here is deaths of despair in England, same age group, 45 to 54, and you've got women on the left and men on the right. What I probably should have said earlier about men and women is these things are much lower for women than they are for men. But the rate of increase, the number of deaths, additional deaths, is the same across sexes. And that might not be true in Britain to the same extent, but the red line at the bottom are deaths of despair. And you can see that in this age group for both men and women, they're now exceeded heart disease, deaths from heart disease. So, these are tiny compared with the numbers you've been seeing in the US, but the threat is clearly there. It's also very strongly geographically structured. So there's been a lot of press about Blackpool, for instance, where many opioid deaths are taking place. But there are almost no opioid deaths in London and many opioid deaths in the northeast in Cumbria, for instance. Here is the change in deaths of despair, rate of change. And you can see there's some effect in all the English-speaking countries. The UK, Ireland, Canada, and Australia, which are right there. And there's a little bit in Sweden, a sort of honorary English-speaking country. You can see the US whites, which is the big pillar there, and for US blacks. I should maybe just say parenthetically about the US blacks. What seems to have happened there is, as a legacy of previous drug epidemics, there are a large number of African Americans in city centers, particularly, who've been using heroin for many years and using heroin stably, in that you can function pretty well as a stable heroin addict. But fentanyl has come in large quantities. And given that this heroin is illegal, you have no control over the quality of the drug. And so if you get fentanyl into that supply, you die. And that's what's been happening. Fentanyl is a big problem here. It's a big problem throughout Europe. It's incredibly strong. It's 100 times stronger than heroin. Because it's so strong, even minute, it's very hard to detect when people are smuggling it, because you can smuggle a lot of money's worth in a very small space. This graph is probably, but this shows that some of this is happening. Here's the UK here. This is just people who report good or very good health in the European Social Survey. And the red line is the later date, which is 2014, and the blue line is earlier dates. And you can see that in midlife, the fraction reporting themselves in good or excellent health has fallen. In old age and in the beginning of life, that young people are doing relatively well. And that pattern's not uniform across Europe, but it's pretty common. And you see some of what's happening in the US here. In the US, you have this extraordinary situation right now that people in midlife report much more pain than people the elderly, right? And I can tell you that's not true. That's a violation of the laws of nature. Pain goes up with age. And of course, it's a pure cohort effect. These people in their 50s are going to be in even more pain when they get to be old. But the pain has risen so much in midlife that it's actually taken over. That's not happening in Europe. It's not happening for people at the beginning. So I was asked to say, maybe I wasn't asked to say, but I couldn't resist some thoughts on social science. So I just have a couple of slides here. And these are things I've learned along the way. One of the nice things about finding out something like this and working on it is you learn quite a lot about, you think, why am I doing this, and what have I learned from what I didn't know before. One thing that's become super transparent is that disciplinary silos are a real catastrophe if you're trying to do this sort of work. And they're extremely well defended. I mean, and I'm sure many of you know that already. But it's dangerous to trespass. I mean, if you're young, it might terminate your career. But it's also clear that even if you're fairly senior like I am, and you're fairly protected, people tend not to come after me in the way that they would have done. It's pretty clear that a lot of my colleagues think we're wasting our time, and why are you doing this stuff? It's not economics. You're squandering your talents. This is sociology. This is demography, and so on. So quite a lot of disciplinary hostility, so it's quite hard. And also, if you can't go after the young people because they get pilloried for it. If you go after the older people, they've got very successful doing what they're doing. And so they don't have very many obvious alternatives. But, I mean, it's clear that we've learned a ton from talking to sociologists. We have really good sociologists at Princeton. I spent a lot of time with Sarah McClanahan, who's been really, really useful and who's worked on this stuff. Bob Putnam's been really helpful and will talk to me when I need him. But we've talked to a lot of philosophers. I've always read a lot of history. The history is a very important part of these stories because there are all these parallels or echoes of what's happening, and especially from demography. So, again, I've always been interested in that. But it's not economists who are the only ones at fault. If you think my colleagues don't like what I'm doing, you should talk to some of the epidemiologists, whose first reaction was, this is wrong, whose second reaction was, well, it's only partly right, and the third reaction was, we thought of it first. We've had a lot of that from some parts of the space, but more support than not, and more support outside of economics, I think. The other thing that's very important and economists like to get wrong is economists focus on money and material well-being. And it's, you can't tell a story of any of this by thinking about material well-being. I think of it as the Chicago heresy. Everything's in terms of money, sort of idea. So health, democratic participation, religion, and family life are all very, very important parts of this thing. And despair is much deeper than loss of material well-being. I think loss of material well-being is relatively easy to withstand, but undermining status and dignity and the meaning of life is really much, much more important. And I think religion is hugely important. Religion is not a fashionable subject to work on in the United States, especially on the East and West Coast, but it's incredibly important to most Americans. The church that John Witherspoon, who was, a Scottish Presbyterian minister in Paisley, who had a vision that the kingdom of God was going to come in America and not in Scotland in 1740, and who went across the Atlantic to become the first effective president of Princeton, is the church that he founded on the main street in Princeton is an absolutely vital, thriving center of community in Princeton that cuts right across social class. And, it's a hugely important part of life in one of the richest towns in America. So, it's really not like here. Just a few words about data. The big problem in some sense is the disciplinary silos, until quite recently, have tended to infect our data sources. So you get economic surveys and you get health surveys, but there's no economic questions in the health surveys. And that's changed a lot. So there are big suites of surveys in the US that now do that better. And the merging of administrative data is becoming very effective. The problem with big data, of course, is it tends to be very skinny in the sense that it only has a few of the variables you need. And I've been at many seminars when someone's, come in with 50 million observations and really nailed something. But the people who've been working on this their whole lives are outraged because the things that are really important to them are just not there. And so, if you get the income tax records, they don't tell you whether people have been in jail. They don't tell you anything about race and ethnicity, for example. So there's just a lot of stuff that's not there. Our work has been helped by this miracle, which only started in '93, which is in the US, they put the education level on the death certificates. So the education of every single person who died. So these graphs you saw are based on about 50 million individual death certificates. If you don't have that, you have a real problem. And in the UK, we've been working on this a bit, but you have a 1% sample of the census, which you can then merge into death certificates, but you only get 1% of all deaths from that. What you really need to be able to do, which I'm told is going to happen, is you want to take all the deaths and merge them back into the census, which is feasible, but is not being done yet. We also need to know a lot more about space. There's been a lot of very effective work done on space in the US, and that's hard here because when you work with the income tax records, you have no idea where people live. And again, that's something could be done about. There are huge issues in there of confidentiality and all the rest of it, but I think that's really being worked on. It's interesting that the UK is the place that led this. The 1851 census was the sort of beginning of social epidemiology when they started looking at occupations and mortality by occupation, and that whole line of work really began there. One of my favorite stories is that Darwin worried a lot about the fact that he kept losing his children. His children kept dying. And he worried that it might be because his wife was his first cousin. And so he wanted to investigate this by having a question put on the census about whether you were married to your first cousin. And in those days, to get a question in the census, it had to be voted on by Houses of Parliament. And the members of Parliament, most of whom were married to their first cousin, voted it down. And so even Charles Darwin couldn't get the census changed to do that. This is the last slide. I just wanted to say a few things about methods. Many social scientists have become entranced by randomized controlled trials or RCT-like methods. Their value are sometimes clear, sometimes not clear, but they're incredibly bad at answering questions like this because they focus on very narrow things. And so you get, perhaps, if you're lucky, a precise answer to a very narrow question, but you're not going to get answers to the sort of thing I've been talking about here, which require wild speculation. And I think historical methods are actually much better suited to thinking about these things. And I actually think historians are actually rather better at thinking about causality than are many social scientists who have this very narrow view of the way that things ought to be happening. In my view, the ideal world is one in which you can work your hypothesis to the point where all you have to do is do a crosstab. And you can read off the crosstab what it is that you want to know. Of course, you have to do a lot of thinking before you decide what the x-axis and the y-axis of the crosstab are. But, you know, that's where you want to be heading, not towards a randomized controlled trial. And then the last thing is just, the point is, you know, many people think that without an experiment of some sort, it doesn't even have to be randomized, you can't actually find out anything about causality. And that's just not true. I mean, when Anne and I published the first paper in this sequence, what happened was there was this enormous storm of publicity, both academically and in politics, too. And it was clear that people suddenly realized that lots of things they thought were true and lots of mechanisms that they thought would play out reliably had stopped. And so it completely changed people's views about causality and lots of things they thought were true. So, and all we'd done was, you know, cross-tabulate some data from the government website, right? So, and it was the question, of course, is that makes it sound simpler than it was. It's just, why did you tabulate those particular data for those particular groups and those particular causes of death? And that was because we'd been thinking hard along the way. But it wasn't like we did an experiment of any sort. So I'm not against experiments, but I'm against an exclusive focus on experiments as the only way to learn stuff. So I offer that for your consideration for the rest of this meeting. Thank you very much.